Hello, folks. Welcome to another podcast episode of the Regen Life podcast. I'm your host, Wayne Ebersole, and we're happy to have you here. I have an interesting guest joining me today. He's been in the regenerative ag space for a long time, I think in greater than 15 years. And we're looking to ask him some questions and interview him on how to be effective at working with regenerative ag, transitioning, and more importantly, how to be profitable in farming and ranching. So today, welcome, John Kempf. Thank you for joining us on the call.
Hey, Wayne, thanks for having me on here. Have a fun conversation.
Yeah. Well, I was looking forward to, I think I met you back in Pennsylvania, probably back in 2014, 15, somewhere in that time frame.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting what all you had to say back then. And I think you've made a lot of progress since then. You've done a lot of detail work and stuff since then.
Since then?
Yeah. A lot of water over the dam. Tell me a little bit. I don't know that I ever heard the history. How did you get started in regenerative ag?
Well, I grew up on a family fruit and vegetable farm in Northeast Ohio, in the snow belt south of Lake Erie. So an Amish community, 25-acre vegetable farm. I'm the Amish boy that went to school through the 8th grade. At the age of 14, I graduated and I was given the responsibility of doing all of our foliar spraying and all of our irrigation. That in that point in time, that included a lot of pesticide applications, a lot of commercial fertilizers. And the short version is that we headed for a train wreck. 2002, 3, and 4, we had major crop losses to diseases and insects that we couldn't control with pesticides. And then in the 2004 growing season, we had a really interesting experience where we started renting a neighboring field that bordered right up against one of our own fields, and we planted cantaloupe on side by side, new soil, old soil. And at harvest time, soil that had a history of intense pesticide applications, we had 80% of leaf defoliation, 80% of the leaves were infected with powdery mildew. And on the new soil, there was no powdery mildew, not 5% or 10% leaf infection, but zero.
Interesting.
And you can imagine that caught our attention. So I became quite curious and wanted to understand what the differences are between these two plants. That led to a lot of research and discovery. And I learned that it's possible to grow plants and manage their nutrition to enhance their immune system so that they're completely resistant to diseases and insects. So we made a couple of transitions, a major transition on our farm, and then I started consulting for other farms. And that just got legs and grew on its own. So Advancing Eco-Agriculture started as a consulting company back in 2006. And flash forward to today, we're a team of about 80 people, working on close to 5 million acres. I actually think we're probably over 5 million acres here in North America at this point, all across the country, Canada and Mexico as well.
Interesting. Yeah. So the mildewy stuff then, what were some of the things that you started to implement that involved you becoming a consultant? Like, what were the successful things that you started experimenting with that allowed you to start consulting for other people?
Well, the foundational idea, we know that all of us, plants have an immune system that is somewhat an analog of our immune system. We know that all of us, within our body, each of us has our own immune systems, but they don't all function equally well. Some people's immune systems are readily compromised. They become ill with the first cold or flu bug that comes along, and other people practically never become ill, and that's because of the differences in the way that they're supported with nutrition and with their microbiome over the course of an individual's entire life, in fact, from even before they were born. And the same concept holds true for plants. So our approach, kind of from a very simplistic and practical level, was how do you balance plant nutrition to enhance a plant's immune system? And so mainstream agronomy for the last century has focused on how do you balance plant nutrition to produce the highest yields possible. Mm-hmm. And we started looking at it through a slightly different lens, through a slightly different frame to say, yes, we want the highest yields possible. And in addition, we also want functional immune systems. So what does nutrient balance have to look like to accomplish that? And all of a sudden, nutrients that were previously ignored or disregarded now become really important. Now we have to start paying attention to selenium and molybdenum and cobalt and silicon and other elements that have been largely ignored because we're not optimizing for yield alone. We're optimizing for both yield and quality together.
Yes. Interesting. So it became more about health instead of yield, basically, is what you're saying.
Well, it became about the combination of both, because
Yeah.
in order to be profitable, in order to be successful, we couldn't afford to go backward on yield. We still had to maintain or increase yields, but while also getting quality and disease and insect resistance at the same time.
Interesting. So that kind of started, that was the beginning of advancing eco-agriculture. Tell me a little bit about what you've experienced from that time up till today. Like, what have been the big issues? What have been the driving force behind that consulting work?
Can you clarify your question a little bit? Because I could answer that lots of different ways. You're asking about what are the farmers' issues been that we've worked on?
Yeah, so obviously you got called in as a consultant. You were in the vegetable space. You've done a lot, I know, like with orchards and even just like corn and soybean farmers. What was the motivation for people to seek out your services? Like what caused farmers to start wanting to look at things differently than what we've done for the last 75 years?
Boy, you're asking me a question that I've spent a lot of time studying and thinking about. Of essentially, how do people change their minds, and how do we
Well,
begin
I'm
doing
headed
things
there
differently?
because that's been my experience.
Yeah. So I think if you would have asked me this question 15 years ago, I would have said that I expect the early adoption of this approach to agriculture and to plant nutrition management will be in high-value fruit and nut and vegetable crops, because that's where I saw the significant economic opportunity, significant economic upside. I mean, if you can improve the yield, the marketable yield of a higher value crop by 10%, that's significant economic upside. But that hasn't turned out to be the case. Certainly, there are many individuals within that space that are very innovative and that are really leaning into this approach. But speaking broadly, the majority at this stage, we are just shifting away from the threshold. Up until this point, many of the people who've come into this, what we now call regenerative agriculture, this different approach to agronomy and plant nutrition, did so as a result of some type of stress, some type of duress. It might have been financial duress. It may have been significant health challenge with themselves or with a loved one, with a family. Those are the two common factors that have really motivated people to change. There's this phenomena where the pain of not changing needs to become greater than the perceived pain of actually changing.
Yes.
And so as a result, in the last 3 to 5 years, the greatest the greatest pace of change has actually been occurring in broadacre commodity crops, corn, beans, small grains, hay, etc., because they're currently experiencing the greatest amount of pain from a macroeconomic perspective.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. There was talking about the financials. There was an interesting there was a rancher out here in Montana that I was reading an article that he wrote. He mentioned back in I think it was 1895, a rancher came to Montana, raised quite a bit of quality beef, sold it for $1 a pound. And if you think about that in today's numbers, that would make beef around $17, $18 a pound.
Right.
How has what should I call it, commercial farming, institutional farming, prevented the growth and profitability for farmers prior to, and how, in your mind, how has that caused the pain that we're experiencing today?
Well, there's multiple drivers, but I don't think farming technology is actually a driver of. I think it's a follower. It's a result. Farming technology and innovation certainly has accelerated, has produced higher yields, but it has done so as a result of policy directions. The reality is that for the last 5 or 6 decades at least, we've had a cheap food policy at the federal level. And the reality is that farmers have done exactly what the government has asked them to do. That's produced large amounts of cheap and empty calories. And so that has been, when Franklin Roosevelt campaigned on the New Deal, what was his slogan? Slogan was a chicken in every pot.
Yes, that's right.
Why a chicken? Because at that moment in history, chicken was the expensive meat. It was a lot more expensive than beef because growing corn was expensive. Beef was the cheap meat. Everybody had ready access to beef.
Interesting.
And so today that has inverted itself because we have had this policy of subsidizing the commercial production of grains so that they're very inexpensive. And now animals are being fed grains, even beef that arguably shouldn't be being fed a grain. And so now we have had this cheap food policy. And you could also talk about our monetary policy. You could talk about inflation, but it's monetary policy and our cheap food policy that have put farmers in the position of being farmed.
Interesting. Yeah. And I know I heard a lot of people. I'm good friends with Steve Groff. Steve Groff's a partner in our business. And he talks about, we've mined our soils to death, and we've got to actually do something differently to bring the nutritional value back. And that kind of brings me a little bit up to today. There's a movement called, food is medicine. I'm friends with a group that out of Oklahoma that's treating diabetes with high quality, high nutrition food. From your perspective, what do farmers, it's very hard to get farmers to transition. And like you said, it takes pain to do that. But how can farmers start to produce higher quality food, more profit for their acres, if they are just traditionally a corn and soybeans farmer in the Midwest? What can they do to start making that transition?
I struggle to answer this question, Wayne. And I struggle to answer this question because we live in such an extraordinary, opportunity-rich environment. I was very fortunate and very blessed that I grew up in a family where our parents gave us permission to challenge the status quo. We were given permission to ask the question why about everything. Why are we packing tomatoes this way? Why is our packing line set up this way? Why are we doing this way? Our farming operation evolved rapidly from year to year, and if we saw market trends moving in a direction that were not favorable for a major crop of ours, we switched from year to year.
Interesting.
And so this idea that we are stuck in growing corn and soybeans because we have all this capital investment and equipment and storage bins and everything else, I have a hard time resonating with that, particularly when I look around and I see that we have a shortage of about 150,000 acres of elderberries in the country that we're importing that can be grown for a gross revenue of $9,000 to $12,000 an acre or more. I look at there is such an abundance of economic opportunity that exists, but it requires labor, it requires effort, it requires getting out there and doing the work. It's not going to be comfortable. It's not going to be easy, but it absolutely isn't going to be all that hard either.
Yeah.
So I think one of the answers, there's layers of answers to your question, Wayne, but one of them is that if you want to be excited about farming, and if you want to be excited about being financially successful in farming, you must decommoditize yourself. You cannot expect to get there growing commodities and competing with the commodity marketplace.
That makes sense. Interesting. So let's just use the elderberry example. It's pretty hard to harvest elderberries with a John Deere tractor.
Impossible.
Yeah. What are some of the things, and yet, 10, 12,000 an acre, farmers like, how do you even do that, But it's because they have like with corn example, they have so little labor input compared to what it would be for elderberries or some other thing like that. So really it comes down to a mindset. You have to say, look, I'm willing to do something totally different. Is that what you're saying?
The definition of a commodity is that the cost of production matches the market price. Why would you want to put yourself in that position? And I know of a farm in north central Iowa I've got, I don't know, 1,000, 1,100 acres, something like that. 20 acres of strawberries. 20 acres of strawberries supports everything else.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
There's 1,001 opportunities like that out there.
What do you say to the person then that says, well, I don't have a market for strawberries in my area. I'd have to ship them. All the kind, are those in those types of examples, are they selling them locally?
In some of the examples they are, but
Okay.
who do you think is closer to Washington, D.C. and New York City? Somebody in Iowa or somebody in California?
Somebody in Iowa, obviously.
I mean, don't make the logistics argument.
Yeah.
California has systemically been losing every single one of their competitive advantages. Historically, they have three major competitive advantages: a desert-like environment with access to water, readily available skilled labor, and so I merged two in my first comment: a good environment, a favorable environment, and water. Well, increasingly in some of these berry crops like blueberries and raspberries, for example, in California, they're putting these berry crops under high tunnels. Guess what? The moment you put a crop under a high tunnel, you lose your climate advantage, because you can put a high tunnel up in Iowa or the Midwest more affordably than you can in California.
Yeah, that's true. Interesting.
There is an abundance of opportunity. We just got to wake up and take advantage of it.
So it's a perspective change is what you're saying. It's like Gabe Brown said, the 6 inches between the two ears. Yeah. So I've dealt with this, and you probably dealt with this too. I've talked to farmers about even just trying to get them to grow cover crops. Like it really is a mindset change. How do you convince a farmer to do something different, or is it only pain that can do that?
No, it's not only pain that can do that. It's also inspiration and imagination that can do that. In fact, that's the most powerful motivator, I believe.
Interesting.
And I'm also at the stage of life where I no longer try to convince anyone. I don't need to do that anymore. We have so many people that reach out to us that want to change. You know, Charles Walters used to say, people leave their senses as a group and they come to their senses one at a time. And there are enough people coming to their senses one at a time, reaching out to us that, and there is I would say there's the beginnings of a tide of change. So that it's still early days, but that's starting to happen. And I believe that when you look at Gabe Brown's story and the many other innovators in the space, many people that I've interviewed on my podcast, they're doing lots of amazing things. And the most powerful thing I believe we can do is inspire people's imagination. I mean, when you paint a clear image in someone's mind of what the possibilities are, a vision of what is possible, then that gives us something to aspire to. That gives us something to work towards. And I think that is probably the most powerful thing we can do, is to clearly to inspire people's imagination. And that's part of what I've sought to do in our work, and by hosting some of the people that I hosted on our podcast, is to provide some inspiration. Because when you are inspired and when you deeply understand why, you can tolerate almost anyhow.
Mm-hmm. That's true. What role, if any, do you see the government playing in this? The government has played a huge role in farming for the last 75 years. Through incentivization, through crop insurance, through various USDA programs. Do you see that continuing? Do you see that being a factor in change, or should that more be something that gets out of the way?
Well, you asked a couple of different questions. You asked, what do I expect to happen? And you also asked the question, what should happen? And those are two very different things.
Let's start with what should, and then let's go with the expect.
Well, there are many differences of perspective and opinion on what should happen, but I'll answer the question this way. My personal political persuasion, I've been fascinated by macroeconomics. I've studied macroeconomics and raw materials economics for decades. And my perspective is that we certainly, as a nation, we need to protect our raw materials producers, and that includes farmers. So I don't believe in global free trade as such. So I think there needs to be some type of federal agricultural policy and economic policy. And within that framework, I don't think it is particularly wise to have a cheap food policy. Why don't we have a quality food policy? Why don't we have a food sovereignty and food security policy? I mean, the reality is the United States became a net food importer in 2023. For the first time, we started importing more calories than we exported.
Interesting.
And we have been a net importer of fresh fruits and vegetables for decades. I think it's been a while since I looked at the data, but just from memory, I want to say we import something like 65% of our total fresh fruit and vegetable production. And some of that, I mean, yeah, we're going to only grow a very limited supply of bananas in Florida if we focused on that. We don't grow any currently, but we certainly could.
Yeah.
So bananas and pineapples and some of those tropical crops are going to be imported, but a large part of what we import is from just across the border in Mexico. Some of it is due to seasonality and season extension and so forth. That number, it's not practical to ever expect it to get to zero, but it by no means needs to be 65%.
Yeah.
I mean, if we just looked at this from a national food security, food sovereignty perspective, and we looked at it from a quality food perspective, we would want to have as much of our food being produced domestically as possible. And from a food quality perspective, there is, we spend, what is the number, 4.3 trillion a year on healthcare in the United States. And if we took half of that, well, not even half of that number, if we spent, I want to say if we spent 500 billion on incentivizing and rewarding the production, quality food production, food that has nutritional integrity, that enhances our immune systems, that makes people well instead of making people sick. I'll give you one example of what I have in mind. I haven't done my own homework, but colleagues of mine have reported that there are hundreds of papers in the peer-reviewed literature reporting selenium as a very beneficial treatment for both the prevention and treatment of cancer that have been peer-reviewed. They're in the literature, all types of different cancers. Well, the majority of the U.S. population, or the global population for that matter, is systemically deficient in selenium. And producing biofortified food, if we simply started addressing selenium in our agricultural soils, particularly the soils where foods are being grown that are directly being consumed by livestock and by people, that is something that you could readily afford to incentivize and to reward people for doing, and produce biofortified food that would have a medicinal value, medicinal impact on the entire public, on the entire population. Those are the types of things. If we incentivize the production of quality food that had a medicinal value, you would cut that 4.3 trillion in more than half in a matter of a handful of years, I believe. It's those types of things that we should be thinking about. This is the way we should be thinking about agriculture for the benefit of our people and for the benefit of our farmers and growers. Have our farmers produce a high-quality product and pay them accordingly. When you look at raw materials economics, there's this foundational idea that every dollar that you spend, that you pay a farmer turns over 7 times in the economy in a year. And so, and farmers as one segment of raw materials producers, also fisheries and forestry and mining and so forth. So that means if you want to have a thriving economy, you simply need to pay your raw materials producers very well. And so by having a cheap food policy, it means that we have a farming the farmers policy, and we have a weakened we have a poor economic strength from a macroeconomics perspective.
Interesting. And that gets into the financial thing, which we work with, working with investors that want to make an impact investment. I know we have RFK Jr. in there now. Maybe that's before I get into the investor side of things. Do you expect any level of change from our government in incentivizations, or what's your thoughts on that?
You cut out at a critical spot there, Wayne. You started saying, do I expect any level of change? And that was the last I heard.
Sorry about that. Yeah, with RFK coming in to the U.S. To the Department of Health and Human Services and things like that. Do you expect any policy changes that would move things towards a little more in the needle towards the food, a healthy food type of thing, or do you think it's more of the same?
I have no idea what to expect. I expect turbulence and chaos and a lack of much that's productive or useful. So you could call me pretty cynical.
Yeah, interesting. Let's talk about it from the investment perspective. Like we have a lot of people that, or some people that have expressed interest in financing farming, financing operations. I know what Farmland LP has done a lot of as well. What do you see as the prime opportunities for investors to help move the ball forward in spite of the government? Like, what are the opportunities that you see where they could make a difference with their capital?
The significant opportunity, in my opinion, the opportunity that benefits rural communities and farmers the most is not investments in farmland, but investments in facilitating market access. Now, facilitating market access means different things to different crops in different regions. Some areas, some crops, it might mean processing or milling. Sometimes it might mean poultry or beef slaughtering facility. That can mean many different things, but the reality is that the processing supply chains, processing chains and processing facilities don't exist for a lot of specialty crops or non-commodity crops all across the spectrum. And there's been this increased centralization that has really hurt our rural communities. And I know of many farmers who are doing their own thing. They're investing in their own processing facilities. They're investing in their own grain mills. And it's those types of operations that are really impactful on the community at large, because with a few $1 million investment in a processing facility, you can impact tens of thousands of acres rather than just, a few $1 million invested in farmland doesn't go very far. You invest in a processing facility, you provide market access to many more growers, and it's a lot more impactful to the community as a whole.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, actually. What do you say to the investor, though, that says, well, we don't have a market for that, so we can't invest in that until there's a market for that? How do you respond to that question or statement?
I don't encounter that.
Interesting. Okay.
I don't encounter that. What I encounter, 2 weeks ago, or was it a week ago, whatever it was, recently was Expo West in Anaheim, California. Mm-hmm. And I didn't attend. I've never attended, but I have dozens of friends that were in attendance. And my phone is blowing up the entire week saying, hey, we have a CPG company that is looking for a source of regeneratively grown mung beans. They need enough for 15,000 acres. Hey, we have someone that's looking for oats and they're sourcing oats internationally. They need enough for 23,000 acres. I must have gotten 100 texts like that over the course of a week.
Interesting.
And so I was able to connect. So there's not a shortage of demand. What there is a shortage of is a shortage of bridge building and facilitation, because farmers don't see the demand. They don't have access to what's going on with these CPG companies. And the CPG companies have no idea where to turn. They don't have connections to the farmers either. So there certainly is this blinding gap right now where the farmers and the smaller scale CPG companies are not connected. But there is absolutely a market. There is a desire and a hunger for these types of alternative grown crops that is not being met, and it is not small.
Interesting. That's very interesting. Yeah. No, I've heard stuff like that, like the mung beans thing. I've heard that thing. Oats is kind of surprising. I know, like somebody was saying about, we import a lot of grain out of Canada. We bring a lot of rye and stuff, barley out of Canada. But a lot of that could be grown here too, if we just had the acreage and the farmers to do that.
And again, it's not just acreage and farmers, it's also facilities. It's, anything that's not corn and soybeans is considered a specialty crop in Iowa. Alfalfa and oats are a specialty crop in Iowa.
Interesting.
And if you want to grow a couple hundred acres of oats in Iowa, there's one thing you had better have figured out, and that's where you're going to store them, because you can't just take them to the elevator and store them there, because there is no storage for anything that's not corn and soybeans.
Interesting. Do you, in that situation, if a farmer's, let's just say a corn or soybean farmer wants to transition to growing oats, things like that. Would there be good investment in him putting up his own facilities, or do you suggest more like a co-op type of operation where a couple farmers go together? How would you recommend they address a problem like that?
Well, every context is different. Of course, it depends on the scale of the farmer and the customer base, and there's lots of nuance there. But in general, I'm in favor of processing facilities that can serve a larger base. But also, the reality is that many farmers who are entrepreneurial and driven are starting things off and kicking things off by doing something for their specific farm.
Interesting.
In many cases, without investor support. You know, I've spoken at RFSI, the Regenerative Food System Investment Forum, I think every year, with the exception of one year during COVID. And I've been quite direct to the room. The room is mostly filled with investors. And it's still, regenerative ag is still in its early stages. We're still in the process of building an investment thesis. A number of people are doing really great work in the space, but it's certainly not well developed by any stretch. And so many investors have kind of defaulted to the safe position that, well, we will invest in farmland and we will help farmers transition to regen ag by investing in farmland. Well, guess what? If you are only interested in investing in farmland, that means you want to participate in the safe side without participating in any of the risk that the farmer is taking on. And to speak bluntly, you're not the type of partner that farmers really need. They need someone who is willing to participate in the risk and who is willing to help them get to market. And so that means not just investing in farmland. It needs to be a bigger play than that. If it's not, it continues to be a one-sided relationship.
Do you see a lot of investors opening up to more of the infrastructure side of thing? Or, you talked about RFSI there, or is that still kind of a we can't go there, it's too risky type of thing, or not enough of risk reward?
It's coming, but there's certainly not there's not a fund that I'm aware of that is focusing on that as a particular play. It is for some, it is in addition to their farmland investments. There are certainly people who are working on this space and developing it, but it's still very early days.
Yeah. Interesting. And it's always the early adopters are the ones that have to break the ground, and then eventually everybody jumps into it.
Yeah, which is what would need to happen.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation, John. Thank you. Maybe one more question yet. Where do you see regenerative ag in 5 to 10 years?
I don't know if in 10 years, but I'd say give it 15 years. Regenerative ag will become, regenerative ag has a good chance, I think, in 15 years of being the new normal, where it's no longer called regenerative. It just is, it's the new conventional.
Yeah.
And that could happen through several different drivers. It could happen through policy adaptations and changes. And it could also happen as without any policy support, because what has been interesting for us to observe is, as we've worked with farmers managing their agronomy and their plant nutrition differently, what usually happens is after a year or two, when we get the system really dialed in, it's become common for us to expect yields to go up while input costs go down. And you know what that means? All of a sudden, it means the regenerative grower is now the low-cost producer. So if they're the low-cost producer, and we continue the trend that's been true for the last 100 years of continuing this financial race to the bottom, of always increasing yields and producing more with less, then the pathway to being an effective competitor in the next 10 to 15 years is going to be a regenerative farmer.
Do you see, so there's a lot of baby boomer generation that are farmers that are transitioning out. Do you see a wholesale change in farming to regenerative ag in the next 10, 15 years? Or do you think it, I think currently we're less than 5% of our ag land is farmed regenerative. Do you see that number going up significantly or staying about the same?
I think change happens slowly and then it happens fast. So I think it could take. I'm just doing some spitballing here, and I've actually looked at this in detail previously, but I don't remember the close numbers right now. But I think it could take 10 years to get to 15%, and then take 5 years to get to 60%.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's cool. Well, thank you, John. How do people get a hold of you? How do they get in touch with you, or how do farmers get in touch with you if they want your services and your help?
That's pretty easy. My email is pretty easy, john@johnkempf.com. You can find me online. I have a website at johnkempf.com. I'm on a lot of social media platforms, although I'm not hugely active on those. But people can reach me there, connect with me there, and yeah, I'm pretty accessible. Also, our podcast is the Regenerative Agriculture Podcast. We've had a lot of fun with that. My team surprised me a little bit about this time last year, maybe roughly 8-9 months ago. They said, "Hey, by the way, you're in the number one spot in the natural sciences category on Apple Podcasts in the U.S." It's like, huh, okay, well, I'm not doing this for the stats, but that's kind of cool.
That's cool. Yeah. And we've seen that with our podcast. There's a lot of people, a lot of interest in it, and I had Jason Malco on from Indiana, and it was titled under Farming Weird with his intercropping stuff. And that was our hottest podcast. So
Yeah.
anyway, there's definitely a lot of interest. There's a lot of people, consumers from the market side, at least from my understanding, that want food as medicine. I think that's gonna grow massively in the next 5 years.
But I'm curious though, Wayne, is how real is that?
What do you
How
mean?
significant is that? How willing are people to actually put their money where their mouth is, so to speak? I mean, the reality is we have less than 10% organic food being consumed in this country, and I've got to imagine the people who care about nutritional integrity are a fraction of that fraction. No.
I don't know. I don't know that. For us here in Montana, we don't have a Trader Joe's. We don't have a Whole Foods, which I guess Whole Foods has kind of moved away from that. So whatever organic food we consume is whatever we can grow or whatever a local grower can produce locally for us. So it's difficult to get high density nutritious food here. So it's more of a how would you say, it's more of an accessibility problem maybe than a financial problem?
Yeah. Well, the other thing that I would argue, I mean, we started having this conversation about macroeconomics and policy and having a cheap food policy, but I'll be so heretical as to say that I think collectively as a society, we are not paying enough for our food.
Yeah.
I do think the middlemen and the processors receive too large a proportion of it. But there's all kinds of interesting arguments or and ideas that you can hold in your head. One is just ask the question: do we believe that farmers deserve to be paid more for quality? Well, if the answer to that question is yes,
Yeah.
which it is for me,
Yeah.
the counterpoint to that is: do they deserve to be paid less for producing crap?
Market wise, yes.
And what are we doing today? We are not incentivizing quality when there are no quality metrics.
Yeah.
At least in terms of nutritional integrity. And so, so that's one aspect. So if you want to go back to getting paid $17 for a pound of beef,
Yeah.
or the equivalent, then, which I think we should be, I think our farmers should be paid very well, and I think there should be quality components around that.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. Do you see technology? I know there's been some technology to measure food density and things like that. What is out there that excites you on establishing those types of metrics?
It's still early days. We've made investments in a company ourselves that we are expecting to be. We're about 2 years away at this point from a public release where we expect to be able to measure a phytonutrient profile in a matter of seconds. Of plants initially, and I think it could also be transferred to meat and other things. So that's pretty exciting technology. Other people are working in the space as well. And but we now have, I've seen more momentum and more progress in this space in the last 6 months than I've seen in the previous 15 years. Number of people have been evangelizing and talking about nutrient density and measuring the nutritional integrity of our food for a decade plus. But there's been a lot of conversation and not a lot of movement, particularly on the commercial production side. Well, in the last year, in particular the last 6 months, I've had more people send me their laboratory analysis where they are measuring the phytonutrient profile of their meat and their milk and their nuts and their produce than I've ever seen before. So a lot of people are on a commercial production scale are beginning to look at, hey, where am I against a target? Where do I need to be? How can I improve?
Interesting. I didn't realize there was that much movement in that space. I thought it was kind of still university research stuff, but
Now, producers, the most innovative producers, those on the cutting edge, are absolutely looking at it, paying attention, and figuring out how they can move the ball.
are they marketing then based off of that analysis then?
Not yet. No one's marketing off of it yet, but I know there's one dairy that we're working with that is their grass-fed A2 organic dairy and pretty substantial scale. And they collected milk samples weekly for an entire year just to observe the phytonutrient fluctuations and the fluctuations in mineral value over the course of a grazing season. And now they're intent on moving that needle. And at some point, they might consider making some claims on the label because they are on retail shelves. But that's a decision that they'll still have to explore.
Yeah. The most basic example of that was I worked with a rancher in Western Colorado who bought this ranch that was totally run down. It was covered in Canadian thistles and stuff. And over the period of 15 years, he took the organic matter from anywhere from 0.5% to 1% all the way up to like 7-8%. And all he had to do, all he did was he grew a mixture of high quality hay. That's all he did on it. And all he had to do was publish his forage analysis in the local paper, and he could sell out at a 30 to 40% premium of what everybody else was doing, because he actually had the micronutrients, the rare mineral profiles. He started having zinc show up in there just by building his soil organic matter. And that was, to me, the most exciting marketing opportunity I've ever seen.
Farmers recognize quality. Farmers care about quality, and they're willing to pay for it. It's just a lot of consumers. A lot of our quality components have been masked by sugar and salt and oils and other things. But
Yeah.
A parallel example to one you're providing is a farmer that we work with in Pennsylvania is also growing premium quality forages for dairies. And in that particular part of the world, they sell a lot of stuff. They have regular hay auctions and firewood auctions and stuff like that. And so they have a hay auction that he ships his hay to. And his hay routinely brings a premium price 50 to 60% above going market rates.
Interesting. The farmers know it. They know what's going on.
They're willing to pay for it. They understand milk production per ton.
Yep. Very fascinating, very interesting stuff. Well, we've gone over time here. This is fascinating. Thanks again, John. Anything else you'd like to say before we wrap it up?
I would just like to give everyone some inspiration and some hope. It's at the moments where there is the greatest turbulence from a macroeconomic perspective, where there's also the greatest opportunity. We live in a time where I have never observed a greater opportunity in the 20 years that I've been in this space. And may we live in exciting times is only a curse if we believe it to be so. It can also be exciting times in the very best of ways. So may you have an awesome growing season. May things go well in your life. May the rains be timely, and may you have an awesome day. Thanks for having me on, Wayne.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. We'll see you later.